Good evening. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the country needs an extra 1.6 trillion rand in public sector infrastructure investment, while another 3.2 trillion is needed from the private sector by 2030. Speaking at the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium, Ramaphosa adds that this is what is needed to achieve the country's infrastructure goals. This gathering is a platform to promote and enable infrastructure investment. For more on this, we're now joined by independent analyst Jimmy Moyaha, and he joins us via our telephone line. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining us this evening here on SABC News. Perhaps to start off here, what do you make of the sentiments shared by President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that at least 1.6 trillion rand is needed for infrastructure investment in this country?
Good evening, Mbali, and good evening to the listeners and the viewers. It's obviously a very clear message that the president is trying to drive home around the need for infrastructure development, but I think it's a message that has been on everybody's minds for the longest time. If you just think about the various aspects of the infrastructure within the South African ecosystem that have needed reform. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of things like water infrastructure, where there's been a continued decrease or a dilapidation in water infrastructure over the years. If we look at Eskom's infrastructure, we look at SOE infrastructure, there's been a myriad of areas where infrastructure development has been required, or infrastructure maintenance, and then the development of new infrastructure as well. And really at this point, one wonders whether or not the conversations that are being had actually translate to more than just conversations. I mean, if we compare South Africa's state of infrastructure to the rest of the countries on the continent, we've had other countries on the continent that have been able to develop infrastructure at rapid rates and at rapid times, and that's not for a lack of investment. It's not because they have better situations than South Africa. It's just simply because they are making the decisions and then implementing the decisions. We find ourselves as South Africans in the typical conundrum where we discuss policies and we implement policies, but we discuss and we draft policies, but when it comes to implementation and rollout, there's always a lag in that time, and that's what's causing the delay in infrastructure development.
And what would you say is the state of infrastructure in South Africa?
Oh, it's in a dire strait. It definitely needs to be addressed. I mean, we can't, again, we've got a number of examples across sectors, across areas where infrastructure has needed to be reformed and to be changed. And again, comes back to the struggle that we've had to contend with it's, again, as the president mentioned, that infrastructure development is needed, and this is how much is needed to develop that. But how much has been done? How much has been brought to the table? How much has been actually executed on remains to be seen. It's typical in an election year where we have conversations around, oh, these are the things that should be done or the things that need to be done, and that rhetoric we see happen. But then what happens after the election year, for the 4 years after that, before the next election, is a slowdown in the momentum, or slowdown in the implementation of things that need to be done. And I suppose this is where a lot of the frustration comes in. It's not necessarily around whether or not there are infrastructure projects to be completed, but it's around the rollout of those things, and around the deployment of capital from the public sector and in part from the private sector as well. The private sector would also have their own reservations around the deployment of capital from their perspective, because they have things that are beyond their control, that the public sector needs to take care of, that the government needs to take care of, that we tend to wait too many years on, and by the end of it, the blame then gets shifted, and everybody then says, oh, but we couldn't do this because we didn't have this, or we couldn't do this because we didn't have this. And at the end of the day, the people that suffer for it are South Africans.
And Jimmy, what would you say when it comes to the urgency that is needed to address the challenges in public infrastructure? How urgent do we need that in this country?
Without infrastructure, we don't have growth, and we've seen that very clearly with growth prospects being projected at 1.6% average according to National Treasury over the next 3 years. That means that we're not going to grow by more than 2% in any one of those 3 years for the next 3 years to get to that average. You compare us to the likes of developing countries around the world, like China that are aiming for 5% annual growth, where South Africa has a real capability and a real possibility of achieving more than 3% in any one given year in terms of economic growth. It's a clear evidence that without infrastructure development, we're not creating jobs, we're not boosting the economy, and we're not growing at the rate at which we should be. South Africa, for all intents and purposes, coming into democracy, and for the largest part of our democracy, has been the most industrialized economy on the African continent, and we're slowly slipping behind there. We've become almost complacent to the extent that we find ourselves slowing down relative to our African peers. You look at the likes of Kenya, you look at the likes of Rwanda, you look at the likes of Nigeria that have put in a concerted effort in towards their infrastructure, and they haven't delayed the rollout of that infrastructure. And I think that's where the crucial part of it comes through is the president spoke a lot about the reforms and about the policies and measures that they've put in place, or the amendment bills that they've put in place. But again, the bills are just one step of it. The actual part that's needed is the implementation, is the deployment of capital, is the avoidance of wasteful expenditure where it shouldn't be redirected, because that's where we find ourselves, where we can discuss these matters at length and discuss them all night long, but until we get to a point where the capital is being deployed as it should be, in the areas it should be, we're not going to see infrastructure development, we're not going to see job creation, and we're not going to see economic growth.
And how can investment in infrastructure actually boost South Africa?
It has a ripple effect on every sector. So if you think about the development of the Gautrain and what we did with the stadiums around the World Cup, that created jobs, that built up ecosystems that allowed communities to better service themselves, but also service tourists. It increased revenues. It contributed towards the tax base. It has a ripple effect across every single area of the value chain, having the right infrastructure in place. And to the point around that, I mean, if we look at something like the Gautrain relationship, which was a public-private relationship, that was set to be expanded beyond just what we saw coming out of the 2010 World Cup. It is now almost 14 years later, that expansion still hasn't happened. So again, the problem does not sit with our ability to develop infrastructure. We have the resource, we have the engineers, we have the intellectual capital, we even have the actual capital to deploy into it, but the implementation and the rollout, the time frame towards that is what takes the time. And if we're not going to take that part of it seriously, then we might be having this exact same conversation come the 2029 elections.
And do you think that, with the deadline of 2030 of 3.2 trillion rand, can South Africa reach that?
Very possible. The private sector could reach the 3.2 trillion on their side. The government would be able to raise the 1.6 trillion on their side. It's not about the access to the capital and the need for that capital. Again, it comes down to the deployment and the implementation of that capital. You look at the developments that have unfolded of late in the media space, or not in the media space, rather in the infrastructure development space. We were supposed to deploy solutions to fight load shedding. We're supposed to deploy solutions to combat the water situation that we're dealing with. We've been contending with issues like load shedding for the last 16 years, and we keep getting told it's a problem that will be solved imminently. That's just one example of areas where we're taking too long to address the issues. And you look at countries. Again, I'll use a country like Kenya as an example. They recently signed the development deal with the DPW World, so that's the Dubai Ports World, the company that bought Imperial Logistics in South Africa, to establish a port in the eastern part of Africa and run containers and equipment, or containers and infrastructure through into a new port. The construction of an entirely new port at that speed and at that scale is something that they managed to approve between elections. We have nothing that's preventing us from approving deals of that magnitude and relationships of that magnitude, and we've seen that where the government wants to engage in public-private partnerships, there's hesitation, there's red tape, and until we can remove the red tape, we're going to see hindrances towards development, and we're going to see hindrances towards capital deployment. If you think about the private
Jimmy,
sector
we have
from their
indeed
perspective,
run out of
the president
time.
wants 3.2 trillion from the private sector, and the private sector is going to ask questions. How is that going to be deployed? Where is it going to be deployed? Is it sustainable? Does it make financial sense? And until the red tape
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Jimmy. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for your time. That is Jimmy Moyaha. He is an independent analyst. They're giving us his insights when it comes to infrastructure investment in the country.